Good afternoon, boys and girls. This is All Things Chess with Cybertal. I am Cybertal. Instead of scotch, I've got a nice IPA today, so cheers. Chess and alcohol go together just like... So, we're continuing our examination of isolated queen pawns. We're starting to wind that down. I think the last topic we're going to look at will be a couple of games on when to transition to a hanging pawn structure. I'm only going to do a couple of games in this topic because we're going to do hanging pawns after we do isolated pawns, and I don't want to go too much into the next topic for discussion. But isolated pawns and hanging pawns are so closely connected that you do need to discuss one with the other, at least somewhat. In the background, whenever you're playing with an isolated pawn or against an isolated pawn, there's always at least the possibility of transitioning to a hanging pawn structure, and that should be something that you look at in all of your calculations. There's times to transition to where it's favorable, or there's also times where it's completely unfavorable to transition to it. We'll try to discuss some of the factors when it's favorable or unfavorable to transition. But the example game we're going to look at will be Paul Keres against Jose Raul Capablanca. This is from the AVRO tournament 1938. AVRO 1938, one of the most important tournaments in chess history, really. At that time, Alyakin held the world title. I believe he just recently got it back from Max Euwe. This was sort of an unofficial coronation for whoever his challenger might have been. Ended up Paul Keres and Reuben Fine, another great grandmaster from the United States. They ended up tying for first. But then World War II happened that basically scrapped any plans for any sort of worldwide chess. Aside from the human horror that was committed by World War II robbed us all of a lot of incredible chess masterpieces. If you were to rewind chess history and look at some of the figures that were impacted, like Reuben Fine, Paul Keres, Salo Floor, he was another major figure that was impacted negatively by World War II. If World War II never happens, you might have seen a Keres Alyakin match in 1940 or so. You might have seen a Fine Alyakin match. You could have seen a Floor Alyakin match. And those would have changed the face of chess history. Let's say Keres beats Alyakin, then Keres faces Botvinnik at some point for the world title, because then Estonia is never annexed by the USSR. So it's just fascinating to go through those what-ifs, but really, there were just so many chess figures that could have had a better career, if not for World War II, especially Paul Keres. He's white in this game. E4, E6, knight D2, so the French Tarrasch. C5, again, this is sort of an old-fashioned way of doing it. Modern trends are either knight f6 or knight c6. This would be my choice. I think that's the most interesting. But C5 is sort of the classical response. So ED, this goes straight for the isolated pawn. The modern trend is queen x d5, when I don't think white really has much to work with here. Modern players are far less biased against bringing their queen out early if it's for a certain purpose. Here, the queen can't get hit by a knight c3, so that's why it's a little bit better to take the queen on d5. EX, it goes for the isolated pawn. It's harder to justify having an isolated pawn as black because you start down a move. And that really impacts some of the active plans that you have at your disposal. Some of the active plans that white has with the isolated pawn aren't available for black just because black is down that move. So black has to play a little bit more circumspect. Knight gf3, knight c6, bishop e5. So this is the move we saw yesterday in our video, and this is the best move, just developing as quickly as possible, immobilizing that knight in c6, and it's preparing a potential disrupting check in the e-file. Differences, Capablanca chooses what, in my opinion, is the best choice, queen e7. In my opinion, this is the best move. It disrupts the mechanism that white has planned to try to get developed as quickly as possible. It forces white to block the e-file somehow, and that allows black to develop a bit more soundly. The alternative that we saw yesterday, bishop d6. But in my opinion, this is just an inferior isolated pawn for black, because basically he has to develop that knight to e7. We looked at this line yesterday, but just as a reminder, if knight f6 instead, then rook e1 doesn't really have a good answer here. Because what do you do? On bishop e6, knight there. And suddenly both c6 and e6 are being hit really hard. This is just a bad position. So knight g7 is necessary, but the knight just doesn't really belong on e7. It is just flat out better on f6, but this is sort of the move that black is down by being black. It forces black to make some slightly suboptimal decisions with his isolated pawn plans. So yeah, in my opinion, queen e7 is just flat out the best move, and Capablanca chooses that. Bishop e2, so that forces that back. Cx d4, I would say queen c7 immediately is probably best, and this is the highest scoring option for black and the most popular. And then take on d4. Now black has bishop e7 available for that check on the e-file, and then he can castle immediately. That would be the main difference. And this would be sort of a normal isolated pawn position here, because you've managed to put your knight f6 on f6. That's where it belongs. And then black can just do normal isolated pawn stuff. So cx d4 a little bit premature in my opinion. Castle. Bishop d6. So this, it looks active, but the bishop is just exposed here. In my opinion, this causes black a lot of problems. Knight f6, in my opinion, he just needs to continue developing soundly. Knight fd, and then a6. This is a key move. You're preventing knight b5 as an attacking resource. And then say on rook e1, just bishop e7. And you're blocking the e-file off with that developing move, and then you're in time to castle. I would say black is a little bit worse here. The fact that he had to spend a move on a6 to get developed properly means white is going to be a little bit more mobilized than usual. But this is still a fight. Whereas after bishop d6, white has some concrete choices to cause some problems for black. Knight takes a6. So this saves the dark square bishop, but again, it's another tempo spent when his king is stuck in the center. He's 2 moves away from castling when white has really excellent mobilization. That is a big problem. Now, surprisingly, Keres, he doesn't choose the most aggressive option. Keres, especially young Keres, was an absolute force of nature. Like, young Keres was on the level of Tao in terms of just the insanity of his play. He could attack like no one else in history. And he was still in his prime and still young at this point. So I'm surprised that he didn't make the choice. But first off, instead of a6, black has to choose this. And this is pretty depressing. White's got the bishop pair. Black doesn't have as good a bishop anymore, which is definitely a resource in isolated pawn positions. But at least black can finish mobilization. And then it's a game where he's definitely worse, but he can still continue. After a6, Keres chooses b3, which is just way too passive. It's far too routine. That king in the center should be sort of a red flag to you when you're mobilized like this. In my opinion, c4 is just immediate, direct, and logical. When the enemy king is open, is still in the center, and it's going to take a couple moves for castling, open it up. Go hammer and tongs to go after that enemy king. A couple variations. Probably the best move is knight f6. After dc, the point is knight. Then bishop c4. You get the pawn back, and that bishop on d6 is exposed. This is another drawback of that bishop coming to d6 instead of e7. I don't want to go too far into these lines. They'll be in the annotated PGN notes as usual. One attractive line. Let's say black is really greedy. And then a4, and then bishop a3 is coming, and that black king is going to be stuck in the center. So I give some other lines that you can look at in the annotated PGN file, but really, long and short of it is c4 is just a logical move. When the enemy king is stuck in the center like this, you want to open the position up, be logical. When you have an edge in mobilization and the enemy king is stuck in the center, go for it. That's one of those advantages that it's going to go away. Now, the king is going to get castled, and he'll continue developing. Take your chance while you can. Open the position up and just go for it. So b3, it's logical, but it's just too slow. Knight g7, knight x d4, queen x d4, knight f6 was a little bit better. This is developing. Bishop e2, knight x c6 first. Going for the transition we're going for is better. Castle, black should avoid the transition. He should play knight e5. And this is an interesting fight to come. Both sides have made some errors, so this is sort of evened out. I would say this is a somewhat even position. I'd still tend a little bit towards white, just because I like playing against the isolated pawn at times, but this is a fight. Whereas after castle, Keres finally makes the transition that we're looking at, which which is knight x c6. So first off, the point is that knight x c6 is not possible because queen x d5. And then white's just completely winning. So black is forced to take back on c6 with the pawn. And this is the transition that we're really interested in, this transitioning to hanging pawns. Generally, let's talk about when you want to transition to hanging pawns and when you don't. You want to look to transition to hanging pawns when the side with the hanging pawns when c5 isn't available, because that'll be the key push. When the pawns are like this, when they're on c6 and d5, or if you're playing against white when they're on c3 and d4, if moving the c-pawn isn't available, you should strongly consider doing it. And white's next move will highlight the fact that he can't play that in time. If the hanging pawns are mobile, usually you don't want to consider transitioning, because in that case they can be a strength. They can move up the board and start gobbling up space and attacking. When they're forced to stick like this, where they're forced to stick on c6 and d5, that's when you want to at least consider transitioning to the hanging pawns. So really the key factor is the mobility of the hanging pawns. If they're able to move forward and advance and gobble up space, it's typically not favorable to transition. When they're immobile like this, you want to at least consider it. And Keres' next move immediately highlights the fact that they are not mobile. So c4. Just an example of how quickly this can turn. Let's say white played another routine move at rook e1. Then black gets c5 in, and this is not a favorable transition, because these hanging pawns can move up the board and gobble up space. And then black has easy follow-ups with like bishop b7, rooks to the c and the d file. Black is at least equal, and I would actually prefer black a little bit. But c4 immediately, it attacks the pawn on d5, and it prevents c5 from being played. Now that these pawns are immobilized, they're just a weakness. The hanging pawns are at their strongest when they can actually move up the board and start gobbling up central space. When they're immobile like this, any target that's immobile is more of a weakness than a mobile target. So after c4, white is doing very, very well here. Bishop e6, probably rook d8 was a little bit better. Queen c2, this is a little bit routine. Again, I'm surprised that Keres didn't play this game a bit more aggressively, but queen d4, in my opinion, was a lot stronger. g4 targeting the g7 pawn. That bishop on b2 is a very strong kingside attacking piece. That's why black should at least be considering moves like this. G6, bishop d3, and white has superb chances here. He's threatening to just chop on f5 and then bring the queen back to d4, and that weak and long diagonal is just a humongous liability for black. This is a great position for white. And this is really the nice flexibility of white's position, that he can play on all sides of the board. He can play against the weak pawns on the queen side, but that bishop on b2 gives him good kingside attacking chance as well. So queen c2, it's a little bit routine. It doesn't give away white's advantage at all, but white could have shot for more. Dx c4, this is just a flat-out bad positional move. And this sort of waves the white flag of surrender for black. At the very least, black can keep the tension in the center and try to keep these pawns supported, because as they are now, his d pawn is technically passed, so he could have a passed pawn later on if he keeps the tension long enough. And they're at least gobbling up central space, whereas after dx c4, all he has is just weaknesses on a6 and c6. I should try knight g6. And this is better for white, to be sure, but this is still somewhat of a fight. Whereas after the game, this is just a depressing position for black with no counterplay really to speak of. He's got two weak pawns. His position is much more passive. White has easy follow-ups. Practically, this isn't a hard position for white to play. The conversion is not going to be complex. He just has to load up against black's weaknesses. And black doesn't have any counterplay, so he doesn't have any way of stopping the building process. So this is a dream position for whites. Never let yourself drop into a passive position like this. At least create threats and fight back. b8, h3, not necessary. Rook ac1 is just a lot more natural. Just load up on the weak pawn. Rook b5, this is a creative move. It's mobilizing the rook on the 5th rank for both attack and defense, so Capablanca is at least trying some things. c1. Knight d4. this is a good chance to highlight the human play versus computer play. Knight d4 is the absolute human move. Theoretically, it's not the best. When you sit down with the engine, it'll tell you the a4 is better. You'd be hard-pressed to find a human that would consider a4 in a position like this, because it's just so weakening. Like, you're loading up against these weak pawns in c6 and a6. The thought of playing a4 doesn't really strike you, because you're just thinking about taking advantage of white's weaknesses. But a4 is the best, and the tactical point is rook x d6 here. But knight d4 is perfectly natural. It's just the human move that you play. Rook b6, if rook d5, white can liquidate to a better ending. And I give the lines in the annotations, but rook b6 at least keeps pieces on the board. Knight e6, so this is a flashy and good move. This reminds black that he has strong kingside attacking chances. That bishop on b2 always gives white at least some chances of attacking on the kingside, because it is so strong. Queen b8, knight g5, not the most incisive. There's two options. Knight c5 is my personal favorite. This is a dream position. This is the sort of technical position that you dream of. You're just playing for free against these weak pawns on a6 and c6. Black has no counterplay whatsoever. You're playing for 2 results only. It's going to be a miserable game for black. So that's a dream position. Knight x g5, knight x g7 is given by Keres and frowned at. He said bishop e5 with counterplay, but it's worth continuing this line a little bit farther. There's lots of alternatives. I give only one main line in my analysis, just because I don't want to get so sidetracked away from our thematic learning. Rook d4 is sort of the main difference. Other authors' analysis looks at rook e1, but I sort of like rook d4. Mobilizes the rook along the 4th rank. The knight can't move because of rook d8 check. So the main line is... This is a really cute move. Now you're threatening queen x e5, and that's pinned. So queen comes back. And there are a lot of alternatives, but this basically is the theme of the position after a while. Material is even, but all of black's pawns are completely weakened. The black king is exposed. Both of white's pieces are more active than their black counterpart. This should be a technical win for white. This is a very attractive position. So knight g5 isn't the best. There were 2 options for Keres, depending on what he was feeling like. Rook b7. And this is the last serious error. Rook e1 was a little bit more tenacious than the main line that I give. Black dumps the weak c-pawn to try to get counterplay. This is still better for white. You know, he is up a pawn after all, but at least black has some play here. When you're defending, try to defend actively. This is something I've said a lot in our series. Passive defense almost never works, because it's hard to just sit back and take punishment. You want to actively defend as much as possible. Get your pieces out there and create counter threats. If you're not creating counter threats, you're most likely just going to get overwhelmed eventually. So rook b5 stays passive and just allows Keres to tee off. Knight x f7, not the most accurate. Rook x f4 was the most accurate. Knight x f4, knight x f7 is a very dangerous blow, and this is, again, highlighting the power of the bishop on b2. Just the main mating line is, and this is crushing for white. You can look at the rest of the analysis in the annotated PGN notes. But knight x f7, it's good enough to win, but it's not the most incisive. Takes. And I'll just quickly go through the rest of the moves, but this is going to be 2 pawns up for white, and even Capablanca can't save a position like this. And Capablanca finally resigned here. So, interesting game. Really, the main material that I wanted to go over was that transitioning to when to transition to hanging pawns and not. We're going to look at another example tomorrow. But this is an excellent example of when it was completely justified to transition to hanging pawns. And again, the main theme is you want to transition when the hanging pawns happen to be immobile. Here, it's because of c4. That immediately attacks the head pawn on d5 and prevent c5 from being played. In other positions, it might be because you can immediately you have an open file in the c file, and can you mobilize a blockade on c5, and that's the example that we're going to look at tomorrow. But whatever it is, if the hanging pawns when you transition are immobile, where that side can't play c5, it's often justified to transition to that structure because it's profitable for you. So excellent game. This is one of the classic positional games that you just have in your database and learn from. Tomorrow we're going to look at more hanging pawn transition examples. My name is John. I'll check you later.